everyone, and welcome to this edition of Privacy Soundbites. My name is Stephen Reagan, and I'm the Principal Privacy Consultant and Subject Matter Expert on Privacy and Data Protection at Rangu. With these Privacy Soundbites, I just like to do a brief deliberation and discussion on some of the recent events and developments within the privacy and data protection industry. In particular, I'm going to talk about four things today. First, I'm going to talk about the dispute between Facebook and Apple. This dispute has really ramped up with Apple's release of the iOS 14.5 software, and in particular the app tracking transparency requirements. From there, I'm going to turn a bit to the terms of services for WhatsApp. So Facebook, again, is going to be really relevant in the first part of this discussion. And in that section, I'm going to talk about the update to the terms of services that was first attempted back in January. There was kind of a big PR hubbub about it, and they delayed the implementation, but that is taking effect on May 15th. From there, I'm going to turn to a brief discussion on opt-out versus opt-in. So we see this kind of coerced opt-in in the WhatsApp situation. And there are a number of approaches to dealing with consent and really giving individuals more autonomy and control over their personal information. And I'll touch on that topic really in the context of America, who is quickly in the process, the states within America are quickly within the processes of promulgating their own privacy legislation, in particular focused on the consumer, but nonetheless giving the consumer some more data subject rights. And then from there, I'm going to turn to the last bit of the discussion and speak a bit on ransomware and the extortion attempts in the United States with the data breach at the Colonial Pipeline. All right, so first turning to this showdown between Facebook and Apple. So as many of you know, Apple released its software update, iOS 14.5. And within that update, there were some improvements to the privacy features that Apple is trying to emphasize as a key component of its business strategy, really trying to be an organization that is a leader on topics related to privacy. So within their software update, they created the app tracking transparency requirements. What those requirements are is that apps now must ask users in order to consent to the collection and tracking of their behavior within the context of the application. So this kind of presented a seemingly existential threat to Facebook, or that's how it's being almost received. That's definitely demonstrated by Facebook's marketing and PR campaign trying to counteract what Apple is doing with its software. So right, something that's at the core of Facebook's business is selling information on its users to applications and to advertisers in order to sell targeted ads. So really, this inability to collect this information would really stunt Facebook's whole business model. And so this has been the tension that's developed between the two organizations. And it's kind of an interesting history to look back on. So going back a decade to 2010, 2011, Facebook and Apple really saw themselves almost as complementary service providers. You know, Apple transformed the telephone industry and creating this iPhone that was widespread and massively adopted, and is still the number one smartphone on the market. And within that environment, that ecosystem that Apple created, Facebook was a major player with its Facebook app, and with hundreds of millions of users. And a kind of an interesting relationship developed between Steve Jobs and Mark Zuckerberg, where, of course, Steve Jobs has always emphasized, or for a long time emphasized, the importance of user privacy in this new online space. But he really became a sort of a mentor to Mark Zuckerberg in this nascent period, again, when Facebook is just seeing this massive expansion in users and this widespread adoption. But then things continued, things developed. Facebook and Apple both evolved their business strategy, and Facebook moved in the direction of Apple, seeking to create their own phone. So now these organizations started to move into each other's space, really started to become competitors on a number of fronts. Apple was dominating messaging services with iMessage. Facebook acquired WhatsApp, and then again challenged Apple's dominance in particular areas. And so Apple, in some sense, this hasn't been received well, and with Facebook being constantly the target of ire in the media, Apple really saw this as an opportunity to take a position on a really important topic, privacy, saying and exemplifying how they value users' privacy and want to give them more control over their information and data and how it's used. And so, then Apple rolled out this app tracking transparency that has really caused the consternation of Facebook. And we see Facebook countering with their own marketing and PR campaign, really trying to position themselves as an organization standing up for small businesses. In particular, saying that the ads that they are able to target within Facebook with information gathered from other applications allows them to be really specialized and really particularized in their advertisements. And this has been a boom in some sense for small businesses. And we see Facebook rolling out these ad campaigns where they get small business owners to talk about how the targeted advertisements have really boosted their business really in a difficult and trying time during this corona period. So we see some nuance, some complications, of course, in this messaging. A billion-dollar organization, a multi-billion-dollar organization, positioning themselves again as standing up for these small businesses. And so there's a bit of a tension, a bit of a contradiction, of course. But even turning back to Apple and really examining a bit more their business operations, privacy is something that is being focused within their marketing campaign. But on the other side, you see that Apple operates in China, for example. China is held up as the emblem of authoritarianism, and one of the requirements for Apple to operate within the country is that all information and data collected in China and stored in the iCloud would have to remain within the sovereign borders of China and potentially accessible by the government there. So again, we see these really these nuances, these contradictions, these complexities to the situation, and seeing how these companies are trying to position themselves within this broader context of privacy and data protection. So there are some really interesting results of the app tracking transparency and the adoption or the opt-in of this consent requirement. There was a study published by a Verizon Media-owned company called Flurry Analytics. Flurry is an analytics tool the company says is installed in 1 million applications. Since the iOS 14.5 launch, it has been tracking the opt-in rate every day using data from 2.5 million devices. And the results are really, really, really interesting. So in America, the rate of opt-in has consistently stayed around 4%, while in the broader context worldwide, the opt-in rate is about 12%. So that really shows some very interesting results as governments are seeking to construct their own pieces of legislation. And this topic of opt-in versus opt-out is definitely playing a role. And we see competing regimes arising within America, within the states that are enacting their own legislation. And again, looking at the broader context, thinking a bit about Europe and the GDPR. The GDPR is is an opt-in regime, really emphasizing the importance of consent and getting the consent from the data subjects in order to collect that personal data. We see when opt-in is required, when the burden is placed on the organization to get that consent, the adoption rates are astonishingly low in some sense, and that really signals in individuals desire to have this control over their personal information, and in particular limit the uses of that information by private organizations. So expanding a bit on this opt-in, opt-out regime, looking at the terms and services from WhatsApp. So again, WhatsApp is an organization owned by Facebook. And there was this big concern, this big, again, PR challenging of what Facebook was doing back in January of 2020 when the changes to the terms and services within WhatsApp were first proposed. And so I'm going to turn to that and talk a bit about that next. Okay, so WhatsApp and their terms of services. So what happened? Back in January 2021, there was an issued update to the terms and services that WhatsApp was providing to its users. And again, there's a lot of PR backlash to this, as many users saw it as Facebook trying to get more of people's personal information. And we saw a large number of people move to rival chat applications, in particular Telegram and Signal. Of course, that doesn't mean that these individuals have stopped using WhatsApp. For example, I use both services, WhatsApp and Signal. But this initial attempt was aborted, and but now WhatsApp says it's going to roll it out a second time. So from May 15th, users will be prompted to accede to these new terms and services. The users don't need to do that. They don't need to accept these terms and services. But slowly WhatsApp will, in some sense, compel that opt-in as the functionality of the application will be restricted. So, for example, users will no longer be able to send or receive or read messages, but will continue to be able to receive calls and notifications for a short time. And so again, this delay was in response to this backlash back in January, where viral posts, kind of ironically, were widely spread on WhatsApp, claiming the update would give WhatsApp the right to read users' messages and then hand that information over to Facebook. And so WhatsApp kind of went on a PR campaign trying to refine the message, kind of deliver exactly what is going to be within the privacy policy and those changes, and make those widely known to individuals. So now I'm reading a quote from a WhatsApp spokesperson who said, people want to know that WhatsApp and Facebook cannot read or listen to personal conversations. So this is something that WhatsApp and Facebook cannot do because the services are end-to-end encrypted. And then after that, people want to know that WhatsApp does not keep logs of who everyone is messaging, and that WhatsApp does not share those contact lists with Facebook. This is a global approach to protecting people's most private information, and that's not changing. So end of the quote. And then another quote, we don't keep logs of who everyone's messaging or calling. We also can't share your shared location, and we don't share your contacts with Facebook. So again, WhatsApp refining what is going to be in these terms and services. And really, it's about making messaging with businesses on WhatsApp more accessible for individuals, while WhatsApp provides further transparency about the data that they collect and how it's used. So again, this is an opt-in terms of services, but a kind of a compelled opt-in as the use of WhatsApp will be greatly reduced if you do not accede to these new terms of services. And so this really kind of exemplifies a broader discussion around opt-in versus opt-out and the approaches to this within privacy legislation. So as I mentioned, GDPR really places a big emphasis on consent and getting the user to opt in to allow the organizations to collect that and use that personal data. So that really places the burden on organizations to get this opt-in, convey the correct information, what they're and ensure that this data use is conforming to the principles within the GDPR of necessity and proportionality. And this approach isn't universally adopted. The GDPR is definitely a model for other privacy laws, especially thinking of the examples of Brazil and the LGPD, and in Turkey and the LPPD. So this approach of GDPR is again being widely adopted, but not universally adopted. And one place where we have seen this contentious issue arise is in the context of American privacy law, as the states within America seek to adopt their own pieces of legislation. So we kind of see a number of approaches being taken. The first and most common approach is the strict opt-out. Notably, in every strictly opt-out bill, this right to opt out in America generally only enables consumers, again, the emphasis is on consumer data protection and consumer personal information. So these strict opt-out bills only enable consumers to prevent the sale or sharing of their personal information. To date, no state has introduced a strictly opt-out privacy bill that also permits a user or a consumer to opt out of the collection of their personal information in its entirety. Some examples of strict opt-out in the U.S. include the CCPA in California, as well as Chapter 603A in Nevada. So this is really significant in that, as mentioned above, all but one strict opt-out system has been introduced in the U.S., again, only permits individuals to opt out of the sale of their personal information, and not opting out in its entirety of the data collection. Another approach is strict opt-in. This is more akin to the GDPR. In America, this is the least common approach that would set the default rule, again, that organizations must obtain consumer consent before processing of personal data. Of the 25 bills introduced this year, only 5 include strict opt-in consent requirements. Of those 5, 4 bills required opt-in consent for the collection and sale of personal information. Thus, not only is a consumer's information protected from sale until consent is obtained, in most of these opt-in bills, that information is protected, much like the GDPR, from collection prior to consent as well. And the third approach is a hybrid approach, really incorporating elements of both opt-in and opt-out, depending on what types of personal information are being processed. So, if you think about more sensitive personal information, this will be subject to higher requirements for the processing of that personal information. In a hybrid regime, a controller may collect and sell a consumer's personal information without consent, albeit subject to the consumer's right to opt out. So, however, a controller in this case would be prohibited from collecting or selling sensitive personal information, again, without first obtaining explicit consent. And then one example of this is the Virginia privacy law, the CDPA. So again, we see really the emergence of many responses to this challenging issue of privacy and data protection, and what rights and what control over the personal information is being given to the user. Opt-in is kind of a higher bar, requiring organizations to get that consent and that opt-in to the collection of personal information. Again, most akin to the GDPR. Whereas the more business-friendly approach is that opt-out approach, where the burden is then placed on the data subject to exercise their rights in some capacity. And this is a really important debate, because the approach that's going to be taken will either limit how much personal information is collected, as we saw in the example of Apple and the app tracking transparency, and the study of those results, really with only 4% opt-in in the United States and 12% opt-in globally. So when opt-in is the approach taken, it's going to limit how much information organizations can collect. Whereas opt-out, I don't have any numbers in front of me right now, but the amount of information that organizations would have the ability to collect would just be heightened, and then it, in some sense, then the next consideration is what are data subjects going to have the capacity to opt out to? Will they be able to opt out to data collection in its entirety, or only opting out to the sale or sharing of personal information, as is the approach in California? So with that discussion kind of ended, at least within this privacy soundbite, I'll next turn to some ransomware and another issue that's really kind of prominently emerging. Especially now, there is definitely a case, an example within the United States that I will use as an example to discuss a bit more about what ransomware is, and some of the real challenges that are facing key industries that in some capacity raises national security concerns in addition to privacy and data protection concerns. All right, so finally turning to this issue of ransomware and this kind of developing situation in the United States, where an organization called Colonial Pipeline, it's really a supply distribution network for gas that delivers roughly 2.5 million barrels per day of gasoline and other fuels from refineries on the Gulf Coast to consumers in the mid-Atlantic and southeastern United States. This disruption has stopped the flow of this gas, really threatening some critical infrastructure within the United States, and kind of presents the situation of ransomware. And so what is this? Really, ransom software works by encrypting victims' data. So these hackers hack into an organization's database and gain access and control of victims' data, encrypt that information. And often the exchange is that hackers will offer the victim a key to decrypt that data in return for cryptocurrency payments. And so this really exemplifies a situation and a challenge for data security in this context, and really in particular here focusing on the example of the United States government and critical infrastructure potentially presenting a national security challenge. And so again, this is a developing situation, and there's been no official declaration from the United States government over who the hacking group is. Reuters reports that the group is called DarkSide, and really DarkSide is one of a number of increasingly professionalized groups of digital extortionists. They have a mailing list, a press center, a victim hotline, and even a supposed code of conduct intended to spin the group as a reliable, if ruthless, business partner. Their website on the darknet features a Hall of Shame. This is a gallery of leaked data from victims who haven't paid up, and evidently there are over 80 companies across the United States and Europe featured in this wall of shame. DarkSide is hard to distinguish from what's becoming an increasingly crowded field of extortionists. And like many other organizations, according to Reuters, it seems to spare organizations within the umbrella of the former Soviet republics. So again, this is a really interesting, unfortunate developing situation. In the Colonial attack, the hackers took more than 100 gigabytes of data. And as the FBI and other government agencies worked with private companies to respond, evidently the cloud computing system the hackers used to collect the stolen data was taken offline Saturday. So this is a situation to look out for, to keep an eye on, really seeing how the United States government will respond to this hacking and this nebulous area of cybercrime that often operates within the shadows, has really in this instance come to be a very prominent issue, as again some critical infrastructure within the United States was hacked into. And this is really within the context that just 3 weeks ago the administration of President Joe Biden promised a 100-day push to strengthen electricity operations against cyber threats. The top priorities are cooperation, both international and between the disparate U.S. authorities with cyber responsibilities. So this is definitely a global issue We see this global network of interconnected data sharing and data transfers. This emerging global emphasis on the importance of privacy and data protection. Okay, we have that on the one side, and then on the other side we have ensuring privacy and ensuring data protection through robust security mechanisms. And again, so ransomware attacks are something for organizations to think about, to really prepare for, to do a risk assessment and a risk analysis, and have mechanisms in place to respond to potential hacks and potential data breaches. So with that, I'm going to conclude this edition of Privacy Soundbites. I want to thank you all for joining me, and be on the lookout for episodes coming in the next few weeks. Thanks again, and bye.